Nancy Russell needs to be let in.
Thank you, Peter.
You're welcome.
How's everyone doing?
Yeah.
That good?
Well, my daughter has been under the weather for a couple of weeks now and is missing school. So.
Uh-oh.
Yes.
That doesn't sound good.
Mm.
How are you doing?
I'm not doing too badly.
Good.
Yes.
And is your wife not got sick either?
No, she has not gotten sick.
Good.
Yes.
Good.
The frustrating thing is they've tested for everything in the world and all come back negative. So we have no idea why.
There you go. I love it when it comes back negative. Okay, I'm trying to get on my laptop. So
recording in progress.
woohoo, I'm gonna come off of this one and go to that one.
All right. All right.
Can you hear me?
You can.
Yes. I was about ready to throw this thing out the back.
Super Bowl, and the Bruins win the Stanley Cup.
Oh my. Well, Katie is enjoying herself immensely right now. Her dad flew over with her, and then he comes back either Sunday or Monday. I think she starts classes on Monday. So I guess Mike's coming back on Sunday. But they've been evidently WhatsApp is the way to go with all of this when she's overseas like that. And they've been sending some great pictures and taking care of all the last minute stuff that she had to get done once she got there that, couldn't be given to her before. Plus then as Mike says, they have to have at least one adventure a day to make it more fun. So he says, but believe me, it's not a vacation over here, Nancy. I said, you're just looking at it the wrong way, Mike. But she's very excited. I'd say the first day when she got there, because they'd been traveling, all night long. And she told Mike, she says, I'm really homesick already. And we were prepared for that, so right. We all had the same little spiel that we were going to give her. So, but I think then after she got a good night's rest and some food in her, well, then got to ride a double-decker bus and, all the fun stuff that you would think about doing there. So
yeah,
I think she's going to make it after all.
Wonderful. I hope she has a marvelous time.
Oh, I do too. I do too. I think she will. So you probably know all the policies right and left. And some inside, outside.
Uh-huh. I'm not sure where like
So
this is going, but all right.
Yeah, no, I don't know where to look, and I know Tom is unavailable right now, and I don't want to bother him with this. So I was going to get with Coach, but then today just ran away with me. So if we've got two young kids in a same class, neither of which can speak English, aren't we supposed to have somebody in there to help them?
That not necessarily. I don't know. English is a second language. I don't think we have anything on that. But there could well be something, and Ray may know.
So these are two kids that speak Portuguese, and neither one of them speak English.
Yeah. Here we are, limited English proficiency students. There is something. Is a policy so that's what it's called, limited English proficiency students. Okay. You can find it on the policies page.
Okay, thank you.
Fortunately, it's a rather limited. It merely basically says that students who have limited English proficiency must have equitable access to school programs as required by law. And that is the responsibility of the superintendent to make sure that happens.
Well, it's great that they can have access to the education, but if they can't understand the words.
Well, that's what's meant by that, but yes.
And I don't know anybody who speaks Portuguese.
I used to have a work colleague who might have been able to do that. She was Portuguese by ancestry, but I'm not sure how much was retained in the family or not.
Right.
But
well, I'm a bit concerned about these two guys because I know that kids pick up languages easily, but
or at least more easily than adults do.
Much more. Absolutely.
Yes.
I'm just a little concerned about what kind of level of education we're providing for them when they can't even understand what the teacher's saying.
Right. So, well, there is something to point to, so you can certainly go to Tom.
I will, after he gets back. And
yes.
I will. Thank you for finding it for me. Hello, Russell. You might not have been added yet. Did anybody venture forth and go to the select board meeting last night, or at least watch it on CATV?
I did not.
Oh my goodness. Let's see. If I said it was interesting, and the way I might say it with the face I just made, that could tell you that it's crazy.
How
are you, Roy? Good. Who's there? Roy and Russell. He kind of blends in at that far away distance from the I'm not sure. Is he added on as a participant? He doesn't appear to be.
See. Hopefully Coach will be able to join us. Or is he there? Can't tell.
Oh, he is there. He is
He
there.
is there. Okay.
The window's
good.
right behind him and I didn't
Yeah.
see him at all. What happened to all of the invites that we used to get that put us right through?
I'm not sure if we sent them or lost them or what.
I don't know either.
There you go, go ahead, take it.
There we go. I think that's active now.
I
Can you hear me okay,
Coach.
Peter?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. Okay, welcome everyone to our September 22nd school board meeting. It's our community engagement meeting. And I'd like to take a moment before we call, after we call the meeting to order, to have a moment of silence for Superintendent DeBalzi's father. That's why he's not with us today. His father died over the weekend. So if we could have a moment of silence. Thank you. So the meeting tonight, we're going to start by welcoming our guests, our fellow board members from the select board. And it looks like we have 4+. So you guys might have to call your meeting to order as well, since you have a quorum.
Ava needs to be let in.
What he said?
Ava.
Dan Fraser online. Yes. Dan Fraser. There's no Dan. Okay. Right.
We are here.
I can call.
Now.
I'd like to call to order the Hartford Select Board.
So both meetings have been called to order, and we will are there any changes, additions to the agenda?
Hearing none, may I move that we approve the agenda as presented?
Second.
So we have a motion and a second to approve the agenda as presented. There's no further discussion. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? So moved. So Russ, would you like to take section 2?
Okay, sure. So section 2 would be continuing the conversation on how to build a community around issues of anti-racism, equity, and inclusion. And Dr. Mary Gannon will be conducting that session. So I guess you can take it away.
Thanks, Russell. Thank you. Welcome, everyone. Good evening. Nice to see you all. And
Microphone.
oh, sorry.
All right, so those of you who do know me, I know I'm a little bit of a Luddite with the technology, so got lots of support, which I'm very fortunate. Anyway, thank you for having me back, and welcome. And this will be interesting using this hybrid model. So I'm adjusting my design a little bit as we're trying to navigate some of the issues with Zoom. But we're all in this together, right? So I wanted to just first start off setting a little bit of context for what I, in terms of the thinking that I did for this session tonight, remembering that I've worked with this group in the first community engagement session, and also knowing that there will be, you know, hopefully folks from the public and from the community who will be looking at these recordings and sort of taking in this information. One of the things that I want to say at the outset is this work that we're engaging in as a community. So in the school district, the select board, and the community, and all of the various organizations and folks, networks that are part of it, who are part of it, are really working towards this idea of how do we build a multicultural community. And I always think of Dr. King's reference to the idea of a beloved community. You know, what does it really mean to build this beloved community that Dr. King spoke about so beautifully. So I want to offer this idea tonight as we are thinking about how we bring all of us into this conversation, recognizing that we are all situated in this work of equity and racial justice from very different places. So our lived experiences are different. Our maybe worldviews and perspectives on how we see the world are different. We are also gendered differently. We come from different socioeconomic backgrounds. We also come from different racial, cultural, ethnic backgrounds. And there's a whole diversity of different representations that we could talk about, right? In terms of how we are representative, even in this group tonight, of a lot of different forms of diversity. So I always like to say that because my work oftentimes in Northern New England, people say, well, you know, we don't have any diversity here, because what we think about a lot is this idea of race. And what I've been talking more in my work with folks in communities that appear to be homogenous is that there's a lot of different forms of diversity. And so we're going to explore that a little bit more tonight. In terms of thinking about your own, where you're situated, where you're located in some of these different aspects of your identity, and what that means for you when you think about engaging in this work in the community. I also want to say a couple things. I want to not be seen as the expert. I think, you know, one of the things that happens when you have like doctor in front of your name, and I certainly appreciate that. And my father likes to joke about how I'm a doctor, but he couldn't tell you exactly what the PhD was in. So he still thinks it's some kind of medicine. So, you know, this idea that I'm not situated as the expert here, that I really believe when we're in learning communities, that there's a lot of different ways that people bring their lived experiences and their knowledge. So there's a lot of that that's already here. And I certainly bring my own lived experiences as somebody who identifies as white, as somebody who grew up in an urban setting, as somebody who grew up in Maine for a while. And, you know, we all have these different lived stories and experiences. So that's a lot of how I see the world. And it also shapes how I think about doing this kind of work. So I say that because oftentimes I have a co-facilitator who works with me, who identifies differently than myself. Usually my good dear comrade, Stefan Gillum, who is the president of the Windham County NAACP. And we feel like that's always important because he brings a different perspective than I do. So I just wanted to name that I'm here sort of just bringing my own, I'm situated in my own identities. And I think that, you know, that impacts the session to a certain extent because I can only speak about this work based on my own understanding of that. what I'd like us to do tonight is also remember that we are not all having the same experience. I mean, this might be obvious, but in terms of this idea of a multicultural community or building this community that is already working and building here, that we are not having the same daily lived experiences, that people in Hartford are having different lived experiences for a number of different reasons. Certainly our kids are in the schools, depending on some of their different identities. Certainly our families are, in terms of some of their different identities and roles and professional experiences, and a lot of the other community members. So when I think again about this idea of how we all bring these different different aspects or perspectives of diversity, what I want to convey is it's important for us to also remember that as much as from where we are standing, we may think that people are having a similar experience to us, but in fact, that's not always the case, that there is ways that racism, that other forms of oppression and discrimination are impacting people's lives, even if it's not always visible to us. So that will be something, as we think about the strategic work that's happening in this community, that can be a challenge when we come from places where we don't have to think about these things. So for me, for example, as a white person, I have to kind of wrap my head around how structural institutional racism is impacting my colleagues and friends of color, because I don't have that experience. So we're going to be exploring some of that tonight and thinking about that. Okay, next slide, wherever we are.
Share screen.
Okay, great. Woo, I know we're like moving a little bit. So I was thinking of this idea of muscle, because I've been trying to build some strength in lots of different ways. So I came up with this title, Building the Community Muscle for Engaging with Equity and Anti-Racism. So I have a lot of friends who are in my field right now who are talking about these ideas of like racial equity muscle or literacy. And so I think the muscle is also the strength, the capacity, the sustainability to keep engaging with this. So I see this as a follow-up to not just what the first session was, but what you all have been doing, right? And we just continue this conversation. You can go to the next one. Thanks, Fred. I shared this with you all, I think the first time I was with you. I love this statement. This is something that Stefan and I have sort of co-created and been thinking about using in our work as a way of offering a pledge, an agreement of how people want to engage with this, instead of using like kind of bulleted guidelines. So does someone want to read it out loud? Great.
I'm the closest.
Yeah, thank you.
Community agreement. As we begin to discuss difficult topics such as race, class, privilege, and oppression, we all pledge to grant each other as much grace, empathy, and understanding as possible. We recognize that we are all on an individual and collective journey to dismantle and eventually erase oppression and white supremacy systems from our culture and institutions. So we pledge to be kind and respectful to each other, even when we disagree with one another. We pledge to refrain from judgment and instead seek more understanding. And we pledge to move together to hold each other as best we can.
Great, thank you very much. So again, as we
I better
think.
move or I'm gonna keep getting called up.
Thank you. So again, I offer this, and I like to think that this idea of what we can pledge to do, how we can bring our best self forward in this work is one approach as we begin to think about what is the culture or the climate that we're trying to build, that we're trying to sustain as we have these really difficult community conversations, as we navigate through some of these difficult challenges, particularly in this moment that we're in. Around. Sorry, can you all hear me? So again, just wanting to offer that as a way for us to think about how we create the tone and the climate and the culture for how we engage with this really difficult work. in this particular moment. Can we go to the next slide? Thank you. Just very quickly, I've talked about this a little bit. I can tell I'm such an educator. I have to scaffold here with the goals and all this. And I wanted to just, remind us, for those of you who were here the first session, which I think was back in March, we spent a lot of time on language and thinking about terminology and what is this framework that we're talking about. And I know for some folks, it was like, oh, we aren't moving fast enough. Like we gotta get on with the actual work. And I think one of the beautiful things about building this idea of a learning community is acknowledging first that we are all in different places. I think we talk about that in classrooms and school districts. Kids are in all different places. And how do we bring each other along in having these conversations, recognizing that for some folks, they might still be at the beginning stages of understanding. And yet for some other folks, they might be further along. And that there's a real richness in having all of that diversity of knowledge. So what we're going to get at more today in this session is deepening some of the discussion about these issues of social equity, diversity, and anti-racism. Like thinking more about what does it mean for you in some of the places where you're situated, in your identities, in your roles here in the community, whether it's a business owner, select board member, school board member, curriculum development coordinators, all of that. So we're going to be thinking more about what does it mean for us individually to look at this and to do some reflection on that. And we will also spend some time talking about what are some of the challenges that you all are facing around this body of work and practice in this community. We know they're out there. Some of us who are doing this experience them every day. And I think it'll be important to name what some of those are and think about what some of the skill sets are for how we can navigate that, how we can take some action towards moving the needle forward. All right, next one. These are what I use in all the work that I'm doing right now. It's just offering, and I may have offered these to you the last time as well. So I apologize for some of the repetitiveness, but I wanted to be sure that if there were new folks here, that we were all on the same page. Are these foundational beliefs for social equity work? And there's lots of different foundational beliefs, right? Like people can have a lot of different ways that they're thinking about engaging in social justice work, in diversity work, and anti-racism. These are some that I have found to be most helpful, and that my work is really rooted in understanding that we have structural systems of inequity, that's the fundamental root of why oppression and the cycle of oppression and discrimination keeps showing up. So I think about this in a lot of different ways. And one of the ways I think it's important, we'll talk about this more, is that this is important work because it affirms the core values of the school district. When I went back and looked at the website for the school district and also for the town and a few other places in the community, so many of the core values that people have articulated are really parallel to issues of equity, but people don't often see it that way. They see equity and diversity as something separate. So we're going to talk a little bit tonight about what are the core values and to see where the language or the commitment, the understanding towards social equity is really embedded in the core values that all of us care about. Also understanding that these are really complicated issues, right? It's complex, it can be frustrating, it can be painful, but I also think of this work as really joyful. And I think a lot about this idea of liberation. And I think about it particularly for our kids who are struggling in so many different ways, even more so now. And so how do we support what's happening in our schools, what's happening with our students, so that they can really bring their full selves to their classrooms. They can bring their full selves to school every day and not worry about whether they can be there, whether they'll be excluded. So for me, that's really this idea of liberation. Also, as I said earlier, that we are all at all different stages of learning. And this is really an evolution. So I see this as a marathon, not a foot race. That we are all responsible for our own learning. And we are trying to be patient as other people are moving along at their own pace and at their own level of knowledge and understanding. I also think sometimes what I hear a lot, and I'm hearing it a lot right now from a lot of folks who are white, that they are tired, that they feel immobilized by being engaged in this kind of work right now. So I always I say this to myself, I say this to colleagues, that we need to understand that we can't allow that to immobilize us. We can't allow the complexities of it to shut us down. That we sometimes want to have all the information and then we think we can do something. And I say this to teachers a lot. I say, you don't need to know everything to have a response when something is happening in your classroom. That we have to understand that we can't always have complete knowledge and understanding. Let's see. I think I've said some of this already. So the complexity of the issues that we're dealing with are ever present. I really think it's important to always remember history and to talk about history, to think about even the history of this community and how is that part of the narrative that's out in front now about issues of equity and social justice. And then last but not least, these forms of oppression impact all of us. Sometimes when we talk about this work, particularly in the United States, we talk about it as if we're trying to improve the lives of Black and brown communities. We're trying to improve the lives of people with disabilities. And I feel like what we need to be talking about is that we all do better when we all do better. Everyone benefits when these systems are dismantled, when we are interrupting some of the ways that we see oppression and structural inequity impacting us. There's a beautiful book out now. I'm sure many of you know about Heather McGhee's book called The Sum of Us. And she does a beautiful piece of work looking at conversations with folks in Northern Maine and Appalachia and all different parts of the United States, talking about the experience of how these systems of inequity really impact white people. So I think as more of that conversation can come forward in this work, as we can understand, for example, that misogyny and sexism also impact men in the same ways, not in the same ways, but they also impact men's lives. How can we understand that these forms of oppression have a negative impact on all of us, right? Any thoughts about that? Reactions? Additions? Okay. So I think we're jumping into this next little conversation starter. So I am a true believer that when we get uncomfortable, we learn. So I'm saying this out front because for some of us, this conversation starter might be a little challenging and could be uncomfortable because we don't spend time in our daily lives, for the most part, talking about issues of race or our own racial identity. But I am also a firm believer that we need to start with ourselves in order to really be effective in the kinds of work that we want to do. So what I'm going to ask you to do is I haven't quite figured this out, so as I'm talking, I'll be figuring this out. We're going to move into some smaller groups. And what I'd like you to do is discuss the following prompts and then be prepared to come back and talk as a large group. I also feel like this kind of conversation is so important and essential for groups that spend a lot of time together. So select board, school board, as you are building your own cohesion and your own strategy as a select board or as a school board, that these kinds of conversations can, I think, grow your capacity to be able to talk with each other about these things and have a deeper understanding of each other. What I think I would like to do before I move us is the folks who are on the screen, except for Roy, I wonder if we can if you all can mute yourselves and talk with each other. Is that possible? No, it's not. But Nancy and Peter were talking before. Yeah, that's what I would like.
We could, yeah, but you'll hear us.
No,
It's
you all will
possible.
talk to each other, but you'll be muted here.
Oh,
We can't talk to each other.
I don't know. Can we do breakout groups with this
No, we're
format?
not. We don't have the capacity to do that.
Yeah.
So they can talk with each other if you mute
No.
them.
I can mute it so that they don't go out live. They can hear each other.
well,
Hmm. Okay, yeah.
But I can make it so they can talk privately, so we'll be able to.
Okay, that's what I would like. That's what I would like. So you all are going to have a conversation through Zoom, and then we're going to move into two groups in here. And the prompts are, as you can see that are up on the slide, how do you identify racially? What's the way that you identify in terms of your racial identity? Anything that you want to share about that. Then I'm asking you to also craft a 6 to 7 word sentence, if you can, not just individual words, but an actual thought or sentence that describes your relationship to your race. And I'm going to give you a good amount of time to do this because this might. Yeah, so you're gonna sit first. You can work on this a little bit and think about it and then share out with each other. And the last prompt is, I want you to talk a little bit with each other about the impact of actually working on those 2 prior questions. Like, what are you noticing about this exercise? What's coming up for you as you are talking about this? I also want to acknowledge that people, in terms of thinking about safety and comfort, right? Like these ideas of safety and comfort, when we have these kinds of conversations, can get complicated because I always say this work is uncomfortable, and it's been uncomfortable for particularly like for me as a woman or for folks of color for hundreds of years. So I encourage you to think about where your comfort level is around pushing yourselves a little bit, but also not feeling uncomfortable to the point that you're feeling unsafe. That you're able to engage with this in a way that is pushing yourselves in your own learning. All right. So that's great. That's great. And I'm going to give you a good solid like 15 minutes to work with each other. Yes.
So are we being recorded?
Each
in our
individual.
group conversation because we're doing it through the Zoom? And we're live, we stay live, but other people don't? Is that how it is? I'm just curious.
They're going to be muted completely.
Completely for everyone or just from the room?
You can talk to each other.
We could pause the recording for the breakout session.
But it's live on YouTube.
That's what we're doing.
Is it live?
It says it's live on YouTube.
Yeah.
I never know if we're being filmed for.
We're not stopping the broadcast, you all, but nobody will be able to hear you.
You will hear us on YouTube.
Yeah.
No. That's what I'm being told, that no, you will
I was
not
gonna
be
say
able to
anything
be
that I don't
heard.
want anybody to hear, really, but I'm just kind of want to know.
CATV says,
Everybody.
CATV says that it's okay, we're good. And we have
In
to
3 seconds, we won't be able to hear you.
Okay, one more thing. If I could bring up one more thing, we have many participants who are here tonight who are not on the panel. They're listed as attendees instead of panelists. We have to think about whether or not are we inviting everybody in to participate in this activity? And if so, then we need to put everybody on as a panelist so that they could join that way. There are 7 attendees who have access.
Yeah, what are the names of the people, Hava?
Ann Reynolds.
Oh, Anne should be here.
She is here. She's just somehow.
I just mean she should be on the panel because she's on one of the committees. I think that's what it's about.
Yeah, Anne.
Ali Tufingen.
Anne has been added.
Ali Tufingen is there. Russ North somehow. Are you there in person, Russ?
He's here.
Okay. In person.
Ken Kemen is there, and Joyce Perkins is somebody with a telephone number ending in 0178.
So the answer we're giving is as a group or individual?
Anne's here now.
Well, someone just let me in. I've
Yes.
been here the whole time.
Yes. I bet we can now see you. Hello.
Russ, if it weren't for Hava, I'd be gone completely.
Hi, Allie.
I think this is a thanks to CATV. There's Ali. Hi.
So are we ready to get started?
Yeah, is everyone doing it?
Are all the attendees now part of the group? Otherwise, there's nothing to do.
I think there was a decision by someone, and the last time we did something like this, that members of the committees would be panelists. Maybe we should ask for clarification from Mary.
I thought everybody was together the last time we were, I mean, we've been just listening to not excluding people and not having different.
Right.
Now we're excluding
So I
people.
don't know how to communicate with.
Has CATV, if CATV has invited everybody who is an attendee to be a panelist and those folks accepted, like Ann and I did,
Right.
then they should be in this group. I would imagine it's possible that some folks maybe got the invitation to be a panelist and were like, I don't know. So they might just be listening or pausing. So I feel like we have the group that we probably will have. So we could get started with what we have and who we have.
All right.
Did we lose Peter?
Well,
I am here. The
you are
problem
here.
is,
if
Yeah,
there
but-
are attendees who wish to be part of this and
Mhm.
wish to participate in a little group, and you're not letting them in just because there's some other thing, I think I'll leave, because now you've got two.
We aren't. We're
Well,
not stopping them.
it's a matter of
They
the
can get in as
technology.
panelists, they can get in. You've
CATV and if CATV invites them, like we got the little
But
notice.
we don't know if they have. do we?
Yeah,
Yeah.
we won't know that. So my assumption is that CATV has put the invitation up to all attendees to become a panelist. And if they're
Oh,
accepting, then,
okay.
because the
Right.
issue is like, this is the group that we'll have on Zoom because we can't do breakout groups. So it's whoever is here together in a small group.
Sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to let everyone know I'm here. I'm just also watching the toddler and I don't want her head popping in and disturbing you. But I am here and I am listening to everything.
We love
Thanks, Maggie.
toddlers.
Hi, Maggie.
Yes,
We're glad to
Maggie,
meet you.
Maggie.
Hi, everyone.
Maggie, will you not be participating then?
I am happy to participate and I already wrote my sentence.
Okay, so you're no longer just an attendee.
No, I am also now a panelist.
She's been here.
I'm just giving you a heads up that my camera is not off for lack of
That's-
enthusiasm. It's just because of the tiny curly haired child.
That's fine, that's fine.
I identify as a white person. Can I kick us off?
Mhm.
Sure.
What we're supposed to do, go around and everybody respond to these questions.
Mhm.
I identify as a white person. I also identify, racially white. Yeah, I guess. Yeah, that's it. White. Caucasian, which is a whole other root to that word that's interesting to me. But anyway, and a 6 to 7 word sentence that describes my relationship to my race. I remain very curious about what whiteness really means, and the more I learn about it and the more I think about my own whiteness, it's too many words, curious. I am curious and kind of disgusted, but also feel obliged to understand it.
I can share. And then it looks like maybe if we have time to do the impact after everybody shares the first two, then maybe we come back to that one. But also identify as a white person. My sentence, I think, would be removing the guilt and doing the work.
I'll go next. I identify as a white person. My sentence is eager to learn to do better.
I'll go next. My identity is actually in flux. I grew up believing I was Native American. Grew up with the Native American community, and as an adult looking into race, understanding that most white people who have a story about being Native American are not. Anyway, my identity is in flux, trying to identify what does it mean for have inherited race versus cultural identity where you grew up and with how you identified and people accepted you. So mine's in flux. That's what I have to say. And my sentence is I'm searching for meaning. What does this all mean?
I can go next. So I identify as Egyptian American. My sentence is 8 words. So I went one over the limit. I'm sorry. I love being an Egyptian living in America. And I say that because when I was younger, it was something that was really hard for me. Actually, my parents used to have me check off white when we first moved to the United States because they were just so afraid that I would be discriminated against. But as I got older, I realized that like all of these things were ways that my parents taught me to protect myself. And now I'm like unabashedly, loudly, happily, proudly Egyptian American. And I always say Egyptian American because I feel like Egyptian informs my heritage and my sense of like revolution, but American is like my spunk and my individuality and all that stuff. So, yeah.
Okay, I'll go. I'm white. I've been white for 45 years. And I understand clearly the privileges that it allows me in this terrible American society.
I have a hard time knowing if there are other people. So
Yeah.
I'll just go now. How do I identify racially? It's a very interesting and not easy to answer question. Being Swedish, Irish, English, and a few other things mixed together, but those are cultural heritages, not really racial issues. I have a Jewish wife. I have a brother and a sister, both of whom are African American. So how do I do that? I'm most decidedly not Jewish or African American. But at the same time, I have the advantage of being almost neutral about race in terms of it is the assumption of our society that my color of skin, and in fact, my gender, is the norm. And everything else is an alternative to the norm. So in some ways, I don't even have to think about it. It just is. How do I describe my relationship to my rice? Again, it's hard because I'm not actually usually forced to have a relationship with the rice. It just is. It doesn't impose on me. It doesn't result in me being singled out. It doesn't result in me being excluded from participation in most things in our society. So again, I don't know.
I think that's everybody.
Is everybody? I'm pretty sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
Except Roy, who went away. But he's in the space. He's physically in
yeah, I think
space,
it's
right?
physically in the space.
Yeah.
It's just his thing. Okay.
Okay, this third bullet, impact. What are you noticing about this exercise?
Well, I can say that I think that a lot of us either felt almost nothing about it or felt a little anxiety about it. Me being at the end of that, I think.
think we are the typical population of Vermont.
Can you say more about that, Nancy?
Well, we're all white, basically. I mean, we have, I'm sorry, I don't remember the lady's name that is from Egypt. Maggie, thank you.
Yes, hi. Yes.
Hi, Maggie. Sorry, I couldn't remember your name.
No, that's okay. I was also going to say that I identify as a brown woman, but I guess the toddler's distracting me, so I'm sorry. Okay.
That's okay. That's okay.
I also identify as a brown woman, and so does she. Okay.
Good deal.
Okay. Sorry.
So, well, then when you look at that percentage, isn't that basically just about it for Vermont? I don't know the exact percentages, but there's a small percentage of this group that is not white.
Yep.
And the rest of us are all white. And I think that's, I moved up here 22 years ago, and it took me, I don't know how many years before I saw someone that was not Caucasian. And I didn't think about it because I had been living and working in DC, which is just the opposite. And I don't know, it was unusual for me to not see a person of color. And I think probably the first one I saw was maybe when I went up to Burlington a couple of times when the school was in session, and I might saw some students up there going to the colleges and the universities. But I think that looking at our group that, yeah, and most of us, except for maybe Allie, and I'm not quite sure about Hava, and I can't see Maggie, so I can't tell. We're in a older generation, and I'm the oldest one here, so I can say that.
And Anne disagrees. She says she's older.
I don't know. I think
We
Anne
can't
and I
hear
had
you,
this
Anne.
conversation
I
before.
get at 93, I get the banner.
At 93, you get the banner?
Yeah.
Okay.
Where she is.
Are you getting the banner today?
I had no idea, Anne. I'm amazed.
Yeah, she's Energizer, Anne.
Yes. All right, then I'll claim to be the second oldest then.
Maybe.
Something, oh, sorry, someone's speaking.
No, go ahead.
Just another sort of noticing, what it was interesting to hear a number of folks kind of, the question is, how do you identify racially? And then also, I think a lot of folks were bringing in cultural and ethnic identities and experiences as well. So I think it's interesting. It just made me think, how challenging and maybe impossible it is to sort of disentangle some of those experiences. Still important to get specific, and then also sort of, where it gets like, okay, well, this is definitely my race, but then what about my cultural background, or what about my ethnic background that might be in alignment with that, or sometimes conflicting with that.
So I was asked to do something very similar just the other day. Anne was there, and today I didn't talk about my cultural identity, and that was a real choice to do that, because I was aware when I answered similar questions the other day that was where I immediately went, and it was fine. It felt good, and it felt good to claim what I love about that identity. But I'm also thinking that whiteness is a thing, and it's worth having an ability to address it specifically too.
There's a strong argument to be made that racial identity is in some ways an artificial construct that is created to allow us to separate each other from, to define what is different, to define what is separate and other. And as such, it often becomes the excuse for among the worst attributes of being human. It's our ability to somehow separate ourselves from each other, despite the fact that we can't. We're physically on a single world, all interacting together, all needing much the same kinds of things in terms of food, community, love, and respect. And that sort of becomes a fault line to divide them one from another. It's possible to say, I'm Spanish, or I'm Irish, or I'm Swedish, or I'm Jewish, or something like that, and have a concrete understanding of exactly what that means. It's not so easy to do that based on race. Except, of course, if you're not white, and then you're just something else.
Well, I mean, we know that that's sort of a construct anyway, because if we just look back in American history, throughout the 20th century, whiteness was literally defined for the public based upon political lines and basically immigration trends. So, right. So we know that the idea of white is, you know, for actually literally probably in Anne's memory, I tip my hat, and I just never realized that you were our super senior here. The definition of whiteness in our own homes, wherever they have been, has been a complete construct handed to others as a tool, as you say, Peter, of defining rights and allocating resources. Yeah. In exploring whiteness, I'll just chime in. One of the things I've always found most interesting, my heart's always gone out to, are people who are part of a larger culture, and of course this is reflected because it's somewhat of my own experience, who look white but do not, who are not necessarily part of a white environment. And there's a lot of complication that we tend to not talk about in our discussion of whiteness and of othering, that people in those circumstances really struggle with. And I'm thinking in particular about a handful of younger students that I've worked with who really struggle. I would say all of their school years that I've known them, and a few of them are in their 20s now and are still struggling with, what does it mean to be not from a white environment, but to look outwardly as white? And there are ideas of being passers, right? That used to be a common word, to be a passer. And our family culture, in many Native American backgrounds, the idea of having to be a pastor, wanting to be a pastor, was something that families encouraged to cover up your own background and to be as homogenous as possible with the outside world. And so when you take that and you combine it with somebody who doesn't necessarily want to pass because they come from a different environment, they want to honor where they come from, where their home nest has been. It's a very complicated thing, and it's something that I think that there's typically not a place for that conversation in the discussion of race and whiteness and otherness and dark skin, light skin, and in thinking about extricating those issues of cultural background versus political state background, language backgrounds. There's just a lot to pull out, right? What do you say to a young woman who grows up in a family of 5 kids and she's one that looks like she's light skinned as a passer? Right? I mean, where does she belong? How does she feel? Where are her loyalties? How does she feel protected? How does she feel vulnerable? And how do we honor her in our conversations? Yeah. I like to hold space for those guys.
Because I was raised in the South, if y'all couldn't tell. And but most of my adult life, I actually did not live in the South. But in the places that I lived and worked, and I look back on it, and my family, anyway, we were not raised with prejudice. We had a lot of Mexican people around us, but we had very few people of a black color around us. They just weren't there for some reason. And so it never became part of our conversations. It was never, wasn't a problem for us if we had people who lived next door to us who were Mexicans and did have a little bit of a different culture than us. But then when I started raising my children and my husband was in the military and we were moving around a lot, and we always had a variety of nationalities around us. And my kids grew up, and they both are still this way. My kids grew up without any prejudice. We just were, it was our friends, or it was our next door neighbor, or it was my husband's commanding officer. It was their school teacher. It was their Sunday school teacher. So when I came up here, I really, again, as I said before, I really didn't think about it. And then it started becoming brought out in more conversations. And then when we became involved in it, basically in the school board way back when, I had to stop and think about it. And it was, as the ones who are still on the school board at that point know that it was a very difficult conversation for me to have. I wasn't accustomed to it. I hadn't been brought up in that kind of atmosphere. And so it was really hard. And it continues to be more difficult, but it's less difficult now than it was 5 years ago. But but once again, it's I think a lot of it's where you're brought up and what you're taught. And then how do you have that difficult conversation if you've never had to have it in the past? I've taken some courses on how to do that and what is the right way to say it, and I still stumble with it. So it's hard. I think if you've never been exposed to it, it's even harder for you to accept it. And I think that was where I was 5 years ago.
Nancy, we're just starting to round ourselves back in here.
Okay.
Great, thank you.
I'll be quiet.
No, thank you. It was nice to hear all your stories.
You could do anything directly about it. You could fix today and learn from yesterday.
Okay, we are gathering back up. No, nope, nope. Oh, okay. Oh, if they're going to speak out. I could hand the mic off. It'll be more sort of like large group discussion. I can hand the mic around. Would that help? Mm. Yeah. Thank you for coming. Yes. Yeah. Thank you. Take care. I think okay. Did Joe run out for a minute? Okay, great.
He doesn't have the code.
Are you done with the slides?
No. Nope. Next time we'll nail this, right? Thank you, everyone. I had the privilege of listening in a little bit with the group that's on Zoom just because of the way the technology was working, but didn't get to hear from the other group. So what I'd like to do just for a couple of minutes is anything that folks would like to bring back to this large group around your just new thoughts you had around this, around your own racial identity, or how you're making sense of it, how you describe your relationship to it, anything that you would like to share back with this large group. Part of this work is having the opportunity to sit with each other also and just have these more intimate conversations. So it's not so much about what we bring back, but I'd love to hear, and I will say to you, I'm going to shout out to the Zoom folks. I heard some very powerful points that also resonated with me. So we'll get to that as well. So new awareness, thoughts you want to bring to the full group? Yeah, please.
Mary, as a group, we talked about our
what was the first question again? It was how to identify. Thank you. And at least one thing we discovered in our group is whether you're black, white, or there may not be labels to fit everybody because many of us are from mixed relationships. And so having the label black, white, and so on, the other choice could be other, but it just at least made me aware of that we have labels we're sticking on people. You're white, you're black. And that may not always be the case. So I guess that's something we sort of uncovered during our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else from that group?
I'm gonna wait to the third one, because the third question, because that is.
Sure.
Kind of the
Yeah.
thing we want to I'd like to.
Mm-hmm. Anything from folks up on the Zoom screen? Okay.
Well, I think the problem is that
That's okay. Can you hear me?
we can. I think the problem is we can't see each other. So we never defined who was sort of the spokesperson for our group. So
that's okay, Peter. Sure. That's okay. I mean, and again, there isn't necessarily, it's not a formal report out at all. It could just be anything for each of you individually that you want to just reflect back.
So there's more people on Zoom, I guess, because Allie was there.
Yeah, there's a few more folks that came on.
But we can't see.
Yeah. And how about this? How about here in this group? Kathy or Roy, Russ, Coach?
You want to share your thought? Which one on the? I only had a couple, but.
Well, you.
Oh, okay, I'll show them both. I mean, one,
He's got him.
and I don't think I don't need a mic. No problem. Generally, I don't have a problem with that. One of the things that we talked about was the concept of guilt. And I think that's a very important thing to recognize. And in some of the commentary I've heard about in Hartford here about what's happening in the school is basically people saying they're teaching us to hate our kids. And that's not, or hate themselves, I'm sorry. And that's not what's happening here, but that's a misconception that if it's allowed to continue, will snowball and result, I think, in some significant backlash. Because, I mean, you can agree or disagree, but I have a student in the school, and there's no way I'm gonna let the school already add to the difficulty of being a young woman and make her feel worse about herself type thing. So that's very important. And I mean, she wasn't alive, I wasn't alive when a lot of this stuff was happening. So we can recognize it and learn from it, but not go forward, I guess is the way I say it and look at it. Use it as a positive momentum. And I think I came up with the six-word sentence saying, I'm sick of being part of the demographic that causes most of the problems.
Other folks want to chime in or any response to that? Anne, I see your hand raised.
I don't know who just was speaking, but
It was Russell North.
I just want respectfully to say, you said you weren't alive when the things were happening. The things are happening today across this country, and in the laws of this land, the systemic racism, the systemic situation is that Black people can't get what white people can get. So I just have to make that note, and we can all think about that maybe at some other time about what's happening today.
Thank you, Anne. I just wanted to quickly just to come back. I think this idea of guilt is important one, Russell, to just unpack for a minute, because I hear that a lot in my work, and certainly the way that we have this critical race theory narrative that's now getting twisted around, and certainly it's making my life miserable, and I'm sure other educators. Because of course the intention is that we want all of our children to understand this truth about the history of the United States. We want all our children to understand the history of the legacy of slavery, and as Anne is so articulately pointing out, what the impact of that is right now and what the consequences of that right now. So we could talk about that the consequences of the legacy of slavery are why we see a prison industrial complex where we see a higher percentage of Black and brown men incarcerated, right? So there's lots of examples for that. We could talk about it in terms of health disparities. We could talk about it in terms of education. So, and I know that for myself as somebody who identifies as white, I have gone through times when I'm deeply overwhelmed with all of it and understand how the system, as Anne's speaking about, was really, I benefited from. Certainly my family had struggles, and we all have probably different stories of that. But the truth is that the system, the structural inequity is benefiting is benefiting white privileged folks and not benefiting people who come from these other racialized backgrounds, right? So what I always say to folks when we talk about white guilt, I say that gets us nowhere. It gets us nowhere. Most of the colleagues and friends of color that I have in my life, that's not where they want me to be emotionally in that stage, what they are in that kind of affect. What they want is for me to wrestle with what that means and then figure out what I can do as somebody who wants to change the system and be part of that, right, Russ? And that's what you're all doing here as part of the school board. So I'm glad we're raising that up. I had a friend years ago who said to me, he said, I have no time for white guilt because things are happening. Like, we need you. We need you as part of the folks who can help us change the system. Because I think what happens is, as white people, we get immobilized by that. We sort of get frozen by our shame and our guilt, and then it gets harder for us to actually figure out ways of engaging. So I appreciate you talking about that. And I also know that, that it's a process. We have to kind of work through that. We certainly don't want our kids. That's not what's happening to our children. And we don't want our children, of course, feeling guilty or ashamed about anything, whatever it is. Other reactions to the exercise or comments that people want to make about what's been said so far?
About the exercise itself, or
Sure.
When we went through the exercise, one of the things, and Lanny, if I may, thank you so much. Lanny felt a bit apprehensive at the beginning of the conversations, as I would probably say the majority of the people that participated in this exercise, where I be honest, I felt completely comfortable. But the issue was, once we began talking about it and talking about what has become a cliche and uncomfortable conversations, he began to feel more relaxed. One, because the people in the room, he knew, one, were friends, and two, had no judgment as far as what he was saying. And the thing about it that was probably doubly interesting was he said nothing derogatory. He just talked about his experience and where he was coming from. And just that was uncomfortable for him to discuss because of the subject matter. I'm going to relay something to Lanny that and to the rest of you that happened to me. From kindergarten through high school, I went to a 98% private school, 98% white private school, and then went to Howard University. To say it was an awakening for me would be an understatement. I can remember going to a course called Black Literature, and the professor was talking about Toni Morrison and Ralph Ellison and these authors that I had never heard from or never known existed. And I was upset. It was my reckoning with, why hadn't I learned about these things? And I think that we are, as a society, now trying to, and as educators, trying to deal with, how do we explain that, and how do we come to grips with that and expose our children to that, and should we? And that goes to the distortion of critical race theory. So I'll get off my soapbox.
Thanks, Joe. Please do, yes.
Lanny Collins here. So one of the things that I want to add on to what Joe said, and when I was in there discussing things, I think that a lot of dealing with openness with discussing the subject has to deal with, and it's going to come across wrong, I'm going to say it anyways, the intellectual quality, the intellectual ability of the people to understand and to talk about this openly, and to not be afraid to listen to what somebody has to say. And I think that my peers that were in the group with me made me comfortable and allowed me to speak a little more freely. So I think it has a lot to do with the audience you're with, how comfortable or uncomfortable someone is in talking about race. and I felt better because of the participants that were in my group. And I hope that's understood. Thank you.
Yeah, those are great points. Thank you. Again, I think when we talk about how is it that we're building community, whether it's like little sub-communities like select board and school board and H Corey and other organizations that are working towards this idea of a beloved community, what does it mean to be in community, having conversations that are hard, and how do we navigate that? Because the truth is, some people might not be happy with, or might be upset with something that was said. And so again, like, how do we circle back around to each other and understand that because we are situated in these different lived experiences, we will have moments when if someone says something that it might land on someone in a way that doesn't feel good. So I think you get my point. But again, it's this idea of like, how do we build the idea of the muscle? Like, how do we work with this? Because, this all is not going away anytime soon. So if we're all committed and that our core values are that we care about the kids, we care about the community, we have to be building our own skill sets around it. So other comments, anyone from the up there in Zoom? Hava?
This is Hava. Yeah, I just want to say that this was a slightly different exercise for me because for all the talking about racism, diversity, and equity that I do in my professional life, this is one of the only times I've ever been asked to discuss my race and my relationship to my own race. So that was actually very uncomfortable for me. And it was a very different feeling than talking about race, racism, or race in our community, or anything more, anything that was more generalized was easier than talking about something very personal.
Thank you. Anyone from in this room? Kathy, Roy? Coach? I'm calling on you.
Well, I was trying to figure out the 7 words. And I find myself right now, by choice, an agent of positive change. And with that comes a pretty wide range of emotions. Most of the time, glad to be doing that, but there are times when you're just tired. There are times, and it is similar to that sense that Russ was talking about. And it can be painful sometimes when you're looked at as that individual. So what is that individual? Black man doing activism work, Black man on the school board, Black man who coached football, that coached track, that taught school, that was a principal. You start, unraveling, those existences, and each one had its own little chapter and experience. I'll share very quickly, going into being introduced as the principal of the tech center at Randolph, at the gym at RUHS. And those of you who know the mascot, they were the galloping ghosts. So imagine walking into a gym, and in the center of the gym is this picture that really made you wonder if you should leave now or not. It struck that inside. Even though I was excited about being there because the position, it was really weird. You know, it was really weird because it looked like a classroom. You know, but yet, yeah, to most people, it was like, oh, we're just a galloping ghost. Well, you know, we talked a little bit here too about the effect that has not just on the Black person, but on the white person too, in the sense that what must it have been like for a child to be dragged to lynching? Now, we talk about trauma. Imagine that level of trauma. And the thing is, it was carried on generation after generation after generation. So some of that is like latent, like trauma. It's embedded, you know, like in the DNA to a degree, where you don't know what it's going to do when it surfaces, you know, because that's one of the things that we're all trying to understand. You know, what effect does trauma have on any of us, and especially on kids? So, you know, it just stirs a lot of thought, you know, as we unpack this work, so to speak.
You know, Coach, you've been a stable member of the town of Hartford for Coach, you've been a stable member of the town of Hartford for many, many years. And remember you coached in, you know, pretty near everything in Hartford, you know, and I think personally you've been a person for positive change all of your career here in Hartford. And a lot of people have respected what you've done, even in the past, not just today. Respect what you're doing today, but I think a lot of people have had a lot of respect for you for what you've done in the past as well. And I think you've made an impact through everything you've done in the school system in Hartford. So been very positive impact.
Well, it's about the kids. You know, I shared with Mary, you know, basically my educational philosophy, and it's fairly simple. You know, it's tied to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And the first step in that hierarchy is safe. So if you make a person feel safe, be it in our room, in a meeting, in a classroom, then you've accomplished that first step. And anything is achievable after that. You know, and that, you know, I always strive for that, and I'll take that one, you know, right to the end, because I've seen it in action. You know, and it does work.
Yeah.
Maslow had it right.
Thanks, Coach. And again, I think that is also a beautiful context for how we need to be engaging with equity and anti-racism work and diversity work, whatever it is that we want to call it. Because alongside of that, and I appreciate, I'm sorry, are you Lenny? Laney. I appreciate your sharing of what your experience was like having that conversation in your group, and that the group allowed you to bring your full self to it, and would probably also hold you accountable if there was a moment when something was said that needed to be checked, right? So we can do both of those things. We can hold people accountable with compassion, with empathy, as I speak about in the group agreement, and yet also recognize that, you know, this idea sometimes of white comfort, or how we need to be comfortable or safe, that's another session. But we could talk about what that means in terms of how folks of color, for the most part, it's never really safe or comfortable. Like, it's a gift. My feeling is it's a gift when we hear and are given those stories, and those stories are shared with us as white folks, because it does help us understand. It does move the needle, but at the same time, we have to wrestle with what it means for us in terms of our own white identity. So I want to move us forward because I'm noticing the time, and I think I only have till 7:45. But I want to thank you all for your deep participation with that. And I hope it's a conversation that you'll continue to have amongst each other and consider it with yourself. So one of the things I said earlier on was thinking about this idea of where we are situated in this work, with all the different stories, perspectives, identities, where we live, where we grew up. You know, we all have those stories, what we learned from our parents, what we learned from our places of worship. All of that is part of what I call our layers. So all the obvious and not so obvious individual characteristics, the stories, the narrative that we have about ourselves that makes us distinctly who we are, right? So the layers, we all have them. We're complicated folks. Then I think about this idea of legacies and the events, the situations that we have found ourselves in, maybe personally, individually, professionally, the events that we know historically have taken place in the United States for hundreds of years that are so powerful, community events, things that have happened in the state. And the ways that those legacies, those stories have powerful ripple effects that I believe continue to have an impact on what's happening today. So I wanted to present this to you. This is a colleague of mine, Michelle Williams, who I was in graduate school with, and we would talk about like the lens. We're always talking, what's the lens that we're using? What are we looking through? You know, it's like sometimes in my family, we'd talk about the rose-colored glasses, seeing the world through the rose-colored glasses, right? Just wanting to see the goodness. A lens can also be this equity lens, the lens through which we are trying to understand our school district and how inequity is showing up in many different ways, through the curriculum, through extracurricular, through staff, collegial, adult relationships, employees, all kinds of levels. So when I think about this idea of what makes a lens, I was taken by this idea of the legacies and the layers. Because if we were to talk about for a minute, what are some of the events or incidences or occurrences that have happened in this community that still have an impact on the conversations we're having today? Can someone shout one of those out? So what's something that you're thinking about, you could think about in terms of the community of Hartford, an event that took place? It could be yesterday, it could be 10 years ago, it could be 4 years ago, that still has an impact on what is happening. Yeah, Lainey.
Many of us in the room still remember what's known as the Wayne Burrell incident and what happened in Wilder, and I'm not going to go into the details on that, but I think that still has ripple effects in the community today. That even though it's not said, I believe a lot of people still have that thought in the back of their heads, especially when we talk about race in Hartford.
Thank you. That's an example. Others? Anyone else want to shout one out? Anyone up there on Zoom? I'm trying to be equitable in my attention.
I think about when we had someone on the select board who didn't feel safe as a BIPOC community member, didn't feel safe serving on the select board anymore. And she stepped down because she had actual threats that were not from everybody, but a couple very serious ones from a couple somebodies, and she didn't feel safe being providing service and being an integrated leader in our community.
Yes, thanks, Hava. So I bring this to you because I feel strongly that when we think about our legacies, the stories that stay in our minds, that kind of live with us for whatever, whatever they might be. It could be national history events, right? Like I was talking to my daughter who's 18, and she said, Mom, do you remember where you were on 9/11? And I thought, gosh, I used to ask my parents, where were you when JFK was assassinated, when MLK was assassinated? So it's interesting to be in this position now and actually have a memory of that has had a ripple effect on me. I can tell you exactly where I was. So these are the kinds of things that I believe really influence how we see the world. So if we think again about how we all bring this diversity of perspectives and lived experiences and ideas about how we want to move this equity and diversity work forward in this community, I believe it's really important to understand this idea of the legacies and the layers, because we all bring a perspective. We all have our stories. We have this lived experiences. Some of it has to do with age. Some of it has to do with how long you've lived in the community. Some of you haven't been here as long as others. So you have kind of some of that history. And also recognizing that the layers of who we are as individuals and human beings also play into what is the lens and how we see the world. And that sometimes what we're trying to do is break through that a little bit. When we're talking, I think about the work I've been talking with Maggie about as the equity coordinator, about like, how do we break through some of the lens that has been operating and kind of functioning in the school district, in the culture, because that's just how things have been done. How do we want to break through that a little bit and kind of shift it and be more expansive? And that's really part of our work. But I wanted to bring this to you because I think it's also important to understand why we see the world in the ways that we do. All right. Any questions about that or just kind of reflections? I have a little cartoon that goes along with this. Can you flip that one? Thank you. Do you think the owl is a predator? Of course not. He's never bothered me. Exactly. I have no idea what Mr. Mouse was going on about. So again, just acknowledging, again, like wherever we're situated, wherever you are, is how you are understanding what's happening. And our work sometimes just as human beings is how do we kind of think outside of our boxes? So I love that cartoon. Okay, next one. So we're going to do a little bit more work together in those groups again before we break. And one of the things I wanted to just kind of remind you of, though I think this is kind of an obvious, but we would spend more time on this if we had it, but remembering that there are key elements that operate like within organizational cultures. So for wherever you work, you could think about this. Like we could think about it in the school district, we could think about it in the select board, we could think about it in the municipality. But there are core values, core beliefs, and also core assumptions that are always operating in any system, okay? And I believe that part of what happens when we look at some of those core values and core beliefs and core assumptions is that we can notice that sometimes those have been operating ways that are serving a particular demographic of people, of individuals, but not necessarily serving everyone who's part of that organizational culture. I think about that a lot in terms of assumptions. Like there's a lot of assumptions in workplaces, right? Like where people go for a beer on Fridays at 4 o'clock. Not everybody knows. Where do people, go for lunch? Where do people gather in the building, right? So there's assumptions that are there. And sometimes if we don't pay attention to those assumptions, then we assume that everybody's on the same page. The core values and the core beliefs are fundamental, right, to the organization. So if we think about it in terms of the school district, there are beliefs and core values that are certainly part of the mission of the Hartford School District, certainly the mission of the Hartford School Board, certainly the mission of the Hartford Select Board, but they're not always spoken about. So again, there can be sometimes assumptions about, well, I thought we all valued this and maybe we don't all value this, or I thought we all believed this and we don't all believe this. So what I wanted to do was just offer this up as a way to begin to think about when you talk about these ideas of equity and diversity. When we look at the strategic plan and we kind of go back to some of the drill down to the specifics around, working with curriculum, thinking about recruitment and retention of faculty and staff of color, right? It's interesting to start to look at whether those elements of your organization are actually aligned with those values of equity and diversity. And people say, oh, sure, I'm down for that. Like, I'm all about respect. I'm all about inclusion. And then sometimes we begin to look at the organizational culture and realize that they don't actually match up. Questions about this or comments? Does this make sense? I'm kind of rushing through this a little bit more than I typically would. But I think there's just from organizational development work that I've done in studies, these are just kind of the elements of any organizational culture, pretty much anywhere. It could be the government, it could be in a police department, it could be anywhere. And what I wanted to do is to bring them forward so that you can begin thinking about, do the values that we that we hold to be true actually aligned with the work of equity and diversity? Maybe this will make more sense when we go to the next exercise. So here's what we're going to do. Next one. Thanks, Roy. I know folks are getting a little tired. Hang in there with me. So this might be an exercise that we'll need to continue after tonight because there's a lot of questions here. But what I thought we could do is, again, get into these groups and talk with each other about how you understand the core values of the particular structure that you're operating from. So for select board, thinking about your core values as folks who serve the community and serve the municipality. School board members, thinking about, similarly, what do those look like for you as school board members? For folks who are in the community, folks that are here tonight with us that are part of the community, maybe educators, et cetera. And just to kind of look at those and begin to explore what those actually are and how they reflect equity and anti-racism, or maybe they don't. And so what does that mean? That would be a piece of work that we would do, is start to begin to look at how, in fact, those values are now a reflection of equity and anti-racism. So I want to have you spend some time in small groups, just sort of exploring how you understand those core values, how they reflect these ideas of equity. And then the second question, again, we won't get to all of this, is thinking, as we think about the community, meaning the school community, but also the larger Hartford community, whose voice is at the table? I think about, like, who's represented, whose voices are there? And then, as a friend of mine likes to say, whose voice is not at the table, but maybe on the menu? And what are the actions that are needed to remedy this? This is part of moving the needle again around the strategic plan, because sometimes when we get stuck, we're kind of thinking, we're trying to figure this out and wrestle it. Who are the voices? Who are the folks that we need to have with us in this work that we're not remembering to invite into it? And how do we do that? The last question is broad, and we've actually started to talk a little bit about this tonight. So again, thinking about school board members, community members, other municipal leaders, what are the ways that you need to continue building capacity to understand that there is a culture, an organizational culture, that carries a certain set of core beliefs, core values, assumptions, that leaves out other perspectives? And what are some of the ways that you want to continue building capacity to address some of that? And I feel like some of you talked about that tonight in terms of just your own learning and trying to wrestle with some of the things and what this means for you personally and individually. And that's really important work too. So if we could, if you would indulge me like the next 7 minutes or so, I'm just going to have you spend some time talking about, again, what are the core values? Are they matched with equity and anti-racism, the reflection of those? And then also, in that conversation, talk with each other about what is challenging about this. Like, let's start naming what's hard about it. Because there is a lot of conversation. Oh, yeah, sorry. Sure. What are some of the challenges that you are facing, whether it's individually or structurally, like within your, within the culture of the groups that you're here tonight representing? What are some of those challenges? Okay. So should we do, so you're all select board, correct? Okay, great. So let's do that. So let's do select board as a group, school folks, and then all of my Zoom friends will do the same thing that we did before, which is allow you to have some time to talk muted. Joe, if you all come back in about like a quarter.
Go ahead, Peter. Get us started.
Core values.
Well, it's a hard crosswalk to do. And I'm not sure that I'm capable of jumping in and doing it well without having a chance to think about it. That said, there are some obvious issues to me that may or may not crosswalk with this. One of which is that one of the biggest problems the school district faces is the effects of poverty. And that often has an enormous correlation to being in communities of color that have been discriminated against because they haven't had a chance to accumulate wealth, accumulate resources, to access jobs that would provide them with the ability for good housing, regular food, and so forth. And if the assumption is that every student appears at school at the same place in terms of having had a safe place to sleep, a good meal, a safe place to return to, a family that is working well as opposed to one that is divided and abusive and so forth, is an assumption that's been sort of there, and that we are slowly starting to address that. The programs that you, Nancy, have done to provide food, the efforts to do things that reach out to those who are homeless or food uncertain and so forth. Those kinds of things are one of the areas in which we need to bring our assumptions as to where people are starting from and how you make them explicit.
Peter, I think that was a really nice point about how economic inequities are a big part of the lack of equity we have in Hartford and what we look at on the school board, and the acknowledging that it affects families of color and community members of color in different ways. I have to say that I'm not sure I've heard a lot of, and I humbly acknowledge that I am the most recent addition to the school board and have sat through the absolute least amount of work. But I'm not sure that I can recall work going through and evaluating exactly this, which is what are our core values and goals for anti-racism in a structural sense within our school district. And I just think that would be some really powerful work to go through. What would anti-racism in our structure look like, and what can we do to improve our system to help be anti-racist? Ivana, please jump in.
Well, I'm curious to know what you think the role or the place of I know it's a policy, so it's not a vision, but the anti-racism policy informed by particular values that's in the schools. I don't know, I think that there's a wide range of what it means to people in the schools and how it's operationalized and, all that, but and I'm not on school board, so I don't know.
I would say that in general, I mean, I can't even say
that word.
Thank you all. The implementation of that I would say, not be the purview of the school board, because we're strategic guidance. We're not on the ground. That would be a staff issue and a school culture issue. And so while it's a really valuable document and a guiding star, I think it might potentially be a little different than looking internally at the high level view to look at actual structural racism and see what we could do at this level to evaluate that. Maybe there's a role for that. Maybe that's a task we could go on in an attempt to make some structural differences in outcomes, or make changes in our structures to affect better outcomes. I will just put a plug in. I'm always really big on, you have to see it to be it. And so if we don't have really strong role modeling for our kids in the school district, if we don't have really strong affirmative action roles, where we just have incredibly diverse and beautiful people who are here to show our youth the diversity of mentor and leader types, then I think I just put that one plug out there. As somebody who comes from a long line of communications and marketing background, you have to visually represent to youth what things can become in the future, or they will never imagine it. So I just put that out there. Any other thoughts about that? Maggie, I'd love to ask you, but I also don't want to ask you to talk about something that could make you uncomfortable with the school board structurally within the school district.
I'm not uncomfortable at all. And I feel like sometimes I should be more uncomfortable. I have no problem sharing whatever you would like to ask me, but I will say later on in the evening, although I'm not sure, because I'm not sure what time this is supposed to end. I don't know if they're still going to be doing this tonight with Tom not present, but I think there's like an update on how things are going, and I'm involved in that. So I can speak more about that.
Do you have any thoughts about school board, school district level role versus implementation?
That's a great question. So you're asking me, do I envision the school board having a role in the implementation of the anti-racism policy?
No.
Okay.
Because because I think that wouldn't be the case. I think that my question was more about what you could imagine or would wave your wand and see the school board's role in a reinforcement of the dedication commitment to equity, specifically in anti-racism in the school district. And again, that's at a strategic level, and that's not at an implementation level.
Okay.
I'm really putting you on the spot, and I recognize that.
No, I actually don't know. I don't know if I answered the question, like if I understand the question. That's on me. I'm sorry.
Oh, no.
Yeah, to be honest, I don't know if I understand the question. Can you explain it a little bit more? Because I'm totally fine. You're really not putting me on the spot. I'm very comfortable with talking.
Hava, I'm just letting you know that we are coming back together. So I don't want to, I think that's really important. And maybe we can loop that back in what you and Maggie were just talking about, because I was listening in there.
Okay, cool.
Awesome.
Your daughter.
All right, you all.
We want to take, do you have a second? We want to talk about whose voices are missing at the table.
Which table?
Talking table, I think.
So we are going to come back together. I'm conscious of time, and I know there's other agenda items, so I'm sorry to cut off Hava.
It's fine. I just didn't know how much time we had left.
Yeah,
Let's jump in.
sure. I was listening into folks on the Zoom group, and there were some very rich points that were made. So I want to just start with you all. Is there anything that you would want to share back with the large group around that conversation with the first question?
So this is Peter. Not directly as part of the conversation, since I was talking about my difficulties in addressing that first issue, but while the conversation was going on, I went back and did what I often do. I looked at the policy, in this case, our ends policy. And in many ways, our ends policies are not anti-racial or anything like that. They're aracial. They basically don't address the issue at all. It is not part of the matrix of things. It talks about some things that may have to do with equity, such as a caring environment or something like that. But there's no addressing explicitly of anything having to do with the racial divides that exist within our society. It's just not there.
Thanks, Peter. I did hear, Hava, you also posed this question. I think would be a great piece of work for the school board, is to go back. I'm sorry, I'm paraphrasing what you said. To go back and look at the anti-racism policy. And I'm sorry, I'm not, can you, do you remember what you said?
Yeah, sure. It's just sort of go back and look at our policy, what the document itself says, and evaluate whether it's our end goal or because the school board is strategic in planning, not hands-on staff for implementation. That's not our role. That's not what we do. So we have the opportunity to look at structural racism and see if there's any way that we can combat structural racism within our own structure. And that could be just by doing a quick evaluation of goals versus policies and seeing if our policies support our anti-racism goals.
Great. That sounds like a great piece of work for the school board. Anything from this group? Select board guests?
Well, I think the three of us are in the quandary because we're not sure that the school.
We can't hear.
We can't hear.
Hold on a second.
Oh.
We were trying to discuss amongst ourselves if we actually have if the town has a mission statement. We probably do, but none of us are right on top of that. And maybe if we don't, maybe we should be getting onto that. It was mentioned about who we're reaching and who we're not. There's some folks that are just totally tuned out to any kind of government, anything. And so they're probably next to not reachable. And that's what I can share at this point.
One of the things too was mentioned is that there's a lot of people out there who come to the board when there's hot button issues, and they're the people that are engaged for that issue, but they're not engaged totally. And I would be willing to bet that their issue that they're concentrated on, they're not even thinking about the racism or anti-racism aspect whatsoever, as long as their issue gets addressed. And it's a lot of what I want to call NIMBYism, the not my backyard syndrome. If it's not my backyard, not my 50-foot preview, I'm not going to worry about it. I'm just let it go along. And when it gets in my 50-foot view, then I'm going to address it to the board to complain about it, along with the other people that could see it in their 50-foot view or the rearview mirror. And that's one of the things that's troublesome, is that if we get more participation during the dull moments, as well as the contentious moments, we'd be far better off as a board. So that's the difficult part.
Thank you for that. I was thinking that there are some similarities in terms of how select board and school board, are thinking about what it means to bring these conversations, right, in this body work. And then there's just some distinctions because you're charged with different responsibilities. And I hear this in my town all the time because I attend my select board meetings. And I think the question becomes, what are those core values? And it takes time to kind of pull people in to say, like, we all do better when we all do better. Everyone is impacted. Everyone benefits when everyone is doing better. But that message can take a long time to sink in if folks are really kind of stuck on what their particular issue is or perspective, right?
Thank you again. Just to add to that, we were just giving examples. I don't know if the school deals with as much of these types of things as the town does, but we were discussing, the option of building a pool or repairing cemeteries. Is which do you want to spend your money on? As we talked, the cemetery issue is probably not very sexy, but the idea of a concept of a new pool or a new thing, new Maxfield, whatever it might be, say sports related or something, might get a lot more attention, but we still have to deal with all the issues. So it's a broad spectrum.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Thank you. I'm going to move us just because I'm conscious of the time, but I appreciate all the contributions. And I'll share this PowerPoint with someone who would like it from the school board so that maybe you can go back to some of these questions. So again, I've talked this a little bit tonight, think about this idea of like, how do we move the needle? How are we thinking collectively? And then again, in sort of our substructures here of select board, school board, H-Corey, other structures around moving the needle on these directives. I keep talking about the strategic plan as a blueprint. So there is a particular blueprint that we offered several years ago, but I want folks to think of that as a working document. It's not set in stone. It's probably something to look and say, this is different than it was 2-3 years ago. So there can be revisions and there can be updates to it, but we hope that it's a framework because it's fundamental about these ideas of equity and diversity. And then to also just be continuing this conversation. What does it mean collectively for you all to continue this work? What does that look like? What do you need? What kind of support do you need? Do you need more of these conversations about what some of the challenges are, which we didn't even get to talk about that tonight. So I'm going to stop there because I'm conscious of the time and I know good folks have other things to pass on. But I want to thank you all. I'm delighted that we had some representation from the select board. So thank you for being here and thank you for having me. And happy to continue supporting this work. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
You and the school board for having us.
Well, if I may, to get to some of those questions in a way, we are the elected, leaders for our community. And there's a clear expectation that comes with that. And I think that expectation is that we lead. So that being said, part of that leadership is us doing this work that we're doing right now and continuing to do it. So that when we ask our employees that we're responsible for to do the same work, so they can do even a better job for this community, we are leading by example. And that's mission critical, because we know that we all have to continue this work. So it's one thing for us to say, yeah, you guys go out and do that training. You guys go out and do more training and get ready and all of that. But if we're not doing the same, then it's just lip service. So I think it's important that we continue this work. Our community engagement team, it started with Michelle and Russ. Now it's Hapa and Russ. What they're looking at, is next steps, and we put a little calendar together to continue the discussion, is the EMS policies. What's missing? Are they still up to date? Are they still of value? Do they strike the tone that we want them to strike? Do they include diversity, equity, and inclusion? What we heard today, not so much. So we already know that. So part of that discussion we're going to have with our community that we represent is, how do we shift, the language? Because we felt pretty comfortable about the design, the original design. How do we make it more inclusive and better so that it meets the needs of today? So I think that is an observation that I saw from some of the work from Albert and Michelle and Russ over the past couple of years. And I think if we continue that kind of effort collectively, in our own spheres, we can move our time in a better place.
Absolutely, Coach. And that had been identified and will continue to be identified as we go through and review the ENDS policies to see how we can make them more relevant, more inclusive. And we'll reach out to the community, Corey, various other entities, just to get an opinion so we can make it as strong and as relevant as possible.
Coach?
Yes, Peter.
Before we move on to the next item on our agenda, may I say how much I appreciate personally all of those who participated this evening with us and joined us to do this, both in the select board and Corey. It is very meaningful and very important that you did take part.
Cool.
All right. Anything else? On the agenda, we have a review on or update on EL 10. In Tom's absence, do we have that?
Yes, we do.
Excellent.
See, just so you know, and I'll share it with our brothers and sisters from the select board. One of our policies, and we're policy driven basically, is EL 10. Russ, do you want to explain what that is? Because this will help you as you guys are doing your work on the strategic plan as well?
Sure. I mean, EL 10, the title is Race and Equity. And basically, what it sets out is it sets out in sort of a, it sets out parameters for what the superintendent is responsible for in this area. For example, but it says it sort of in a, oh, we have it up there. Hey, cool. Or we have at least. Sorry. That's okay. But this, so basically it sets a bunch of limitations on the superintendent's actions. And then as part of our procedures, at least annually, he has to report back on his interpretation of the policy, how we're doing in terms of that policy, and provide specific evidence of, if he says we're doing this, what evidence can you put forth, Mr. Superintendent or Ms. Superintendent, to show that that's actually the case? So it is the accountability function that's so critical into the way the school board governs type thing. And that way we can direct Tom, and he's responsible for carrying it out. So he's given a reasonable amount of latitude in figuring out what the best way to do that is, but he still has to come to us and answer to us about that. And we just adopted this policy within like 6 months or so.
Yeah.
So this would be a first round of reporting just to see if we think the superintendent's interpretation is in line and how we're going to go forth with it. So we can manage expectations and make sure we're all on the same page. Is that?
Yeah.
Okay.
So not to ask you guys to hang out any longer, because we've all had long days and stuff. But if you want to look at the recording, if you want to look at the recording of the report that's coming from the superintendent and his team around that issue, it might be helpful, because I know you guys are doing policy reviews and all of that as well. So it might help a little bit with framing.
And is this in your agenda packet as well?
Not, the report isn't. Is the report in the packet?
Joe, if you sent me, I can email it to you.
Yeah, yes. Yeah. Great.
I just, I want to, I'm sorry. I want to move to adjourn the meeting of the select board.
Make motion adjourned. Second that.
So moved.
I love that non-debatable motion.
Oh.
Where we started last year was introducing the anti-racism policy procedure and introducing the strategic plan that Dr. Gannon, who is still here, and her partner Curtis created, and we started the work that was laid out in that plan. One of those items we talked about was hiring an equity coordinator, and that's Maggie, who's here on with us tonight. So the strategic plan, we broke into 3 major categories: institutionalized, inclusive, and equitable practices, promoting strategies to eliminate race-based disparities, and promoting inclusion and engagement of all, particularly marginalized community members. Linked in this slideshow is last year's work, so if someone were to want to review it, they could easily go back and see it. Not to take up your time this evening, but we broke it up into the 3 categories of where does it lie in our community, where does it lie with our staff and students, and the district, the administrative team. So highlights within the community are the on the website, we have an equity and inclusion page that Maggie's continuing to update. Ottaquiche put together a community group with their parents for a Saturday workshop talking about race, and the work with the school board tonight being the second round of our work in that area. With our staff and students, we have the staff has an anti-racism inquiry group utilizing Borrowee resources. The tech center has a JEDI group, which is focused on justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. We have equity teams throughout the district, and we have a student equity group. From the administrative and district side of the world, we have a district equity advisory committee. We ran that last year. Maggie is now heading that. She has taken over the coordinator role. We have a goal within our continuous improvement plan. The elementary administration did a book study, Culturally Responsive Education in the Brain, written by Zaretta Hammonds, and the creation of staff resources, where we share promising practices throughout the district as people start to make progress in this area.
I just want to add that just to remind you that this is the work that we did last year. And so these are still in existence, but that this is the work, the bulk of the work from last year. So this year, we broke it down into these 5 categories because these relate directly to E10. And so we really wanted to show how some of the things that we're doing this year relate directly back to those specific categories. And so actually, I'm going to look at yours because I can see it better. Too far away. For the community engagement part, we have a new, these are new things that we've built off of last year's work. So that there's a family equity team that's working for social change. Again, we have the equity coordinator, we have an equity coordinator community outreach. And so our equity coordinator, and I think Maggie can probably speak to this part. So Maggie, if you want to talk.
I'm here.
Go ahead.
I mean, you were doing such an amazing job. I was like, I don't want to stop her. So some of the things I've been doing, I've been trying to do everything in a community-based way because I think that's the only way that I will be even somewhat successful, is reaching out to different members of the community. So I had a great meeting with Police Chief Vale. I have been attending as many H-Corey meetings as I have possibly have been able to. I've connected with members of the Hartford Community Coalition. And as most of you know, I was invited to participate in Juneteenth. And Kathy, I can keep going if you want me to.
Yes, please. You're doing great.
One of the other things that I was able to support was a BIPOC Family Caucus. Actually, it's sort of modeled after Coach Christie's Social Equity Caucus. A lot of the norms that we have established in that group, and again, we haven't had our meeting yet. The first meeting is going to be next week, are very much modeled after the Social Equity Caucus. The HSD website is something that I'm working to continuously revise and add to, as far as like not only resources for faculty, but already great things that people are doing in the district. And I think, you know, a lot of us have been in education for a long time. We know that there can be amazing things happening and no one will know because we're all in different buildings, we're all in different classrooms, and we're siloed. And it's a shame because, you know, I think education is the best when there's collaboration. And then we have the Equity Advisory Council kind of building off of last year. Kathy, would you like me to keep going or would you like to take over?
No, keep going.
Okay, are you sure? So as you guys know, we did the Mosaic training. Part of that began before I arrived, and part of it is continuing now. Dr. Melissa Crum is doing a really great workshop series. It's been mostly received really, really well by staff. And I think the feeling is like, okay, like what's next? Like I want to do more. So that's really great. But, you know, that's not, it's, I would say, to be quite frank, people who are, I want more, are people that, you know, have already begun maybe their own journey. I think the next step is, okay, like who do we need to show the importance of this work and that you can't do anything else without doing this work? We have the Anti-Racism Inquiry Group. I just had a meeting with them this afternoon, planning the first celebration, which will be outdoors. It will be the first in-person celebration outdoors on the high school lawn on September 30th. There is a self-study opportunity that we've designed for faculty under one of the goals of the strategic plan is provide self-directed materials. So if you want to click on that at your leisure, and you can look at some of the ways that faculty can begin their own self-directed study based on wherever they feel their journey is, which is equitable in and of itself. We have a partnership with Outright Vermont, who are doing a lot of great work for LGBTQ plus youth. And Dr. Gannon has been helping us, obviously, with these school board equity trainings. As far as staff and student voice, I've been working to support staff in establishing building level equity committees and also building level student equity committees, some of which were already in existence, some of which are new. And then I've been doing a lot of class visits. So actually today I visited 4 different classes. And some of the things I've been talking about is, what is equity? What is the role of the equity coordinator? What is equity not? And please come join the Student Equity Committee, and just actually having a beginning of a conversation about structural and institutional racism. Those, I would say, are probably the best thing on this entire chart, because students are actively identifying areas where they want to get involved. And because of some of those class visits, students have really begun to have really great conversations with their peers. And I think that's like, if nothing else, the conversations have begun, and I think that's wonderful. I have done some work with staff on their curriculum. Most of that, because it's only the first month, has been self-identified, like, hey, I'm working through a unit. Can you come use an equity lens here to help me get to the next step in terms of our students? The elementary staff are using a really great expansive new English language arts curriculum. And some of them have come across some areas where they need some culturally responsive teaching coaching. And so Kathy and I have done some of that together. And the instructional coaches are doing the coaching for equity text in a small study group. And then as far as recruiting, employing, and retaining, the job postings have been listed on HBCUs. There is the Creative Lives Partnership, the Immersion Montessori School Summer Program. I think they hired an equity coordinator and a mentor to help her out. Dr. Mary Gannon, who's been amazing to work with, and is like, it's like having a celebrity working with me because she's the co-writer of the strategic plan. So she has such great insight. And then I've been able to connect with other equity coordinators from across the state, and actually at this point now cross states. And we've been having some really great collaborative conversations. And that's it.
Thank you, Maggie.
Thank you, Maggie.
No problem.
And in terms of our future aspirations, these are some of the things that we have been talking about. So when you look at this, think of this as a brainstorm in terms of where we'd like to go and where some of the possibilities are. This is not an exhaustive list. It's just some direction that we'd like to explore in each of these categories. So we would like to, in terms of community engagement, like to connect more with Dartmouth in terms of, in fact, some of these are actually in the infant stages of the process. And this is one of them, connecting with Dartmouth and thinking about how the native speakers, bringing them to work with our language classes. Creating a comprehensive list of mental health, social services, and special ed providers in our district in multiple languages so that it's accessible to everybody. That's also something that's in the works. PD opportunities. There's a group of administrators and staff members that are going to a workshop called Leadership and Inclusive Education Project. That's happening next week. And that's going to jumpstart us towards working on our MTSS process throughout the district. And we have also been granted a large sum of money for diverse text speakers and culturally responsive teaching PD for some of our staff members, and that will trickle down to students as well as the staff members examine their curriculum and bring in speakers for their students. Staff and student voice, equity surveys to assess specific building level needs. And those have not been developed yet, but we would like to work on that. Macquarie Student Liaison, there have been talk about having a liaison on that committee to cultivate and curate the resource library and expressing student needs. So just like we have student representation on the school board, we think that it would be advantageous to also have student representation on the Macquarie committee. In terms of curriculum instruction and assessment, we would love to continue having some more self-identified curriculum audits through coaching cycles. So continuing working with Maggie. And I think that as more staff members interact with Maggie and work with her, I think that more and more are going to want to work with her. It's just going to have a domino effect.
Thank you, Kathy.
Yes, you're welcome, Maggie. That's the word on the street.
I'm blushing, Kathy.
We're also thinking about aligning some independent learning opportunities with diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And we're calling that creative coursework, for lack of a better name. And I don't know if Tom or if Roy wants to talk a little bit more about that.
So that's taking full advantage of the Independent Learning Center at the high school, where we utilize internships and student creative projects. So Act 77 flexible pathways, meeting with diversity and equity work is going to be a perfect match. The Hakori student that is going to take advantage of joining that group will be using the independent learning experience to gather credit for that work. So it's a perfect fit.
In terms of recruiting, employing, and retaining, we will continue as curriculum directors. We're involved with some of the state AOE committees and working to push more lenient, I guess I want to say, or improve access for diverse populations in terms of licensing with the shortage of teaching staff and the need and want to become more diverse. It's pretty difficult to navigate through the AOE's licensing system. And so we really want to work with them to figure out how that can become an easier process. And working with community partnerships. So continuing the partnerships that we have already been making and working to recruit more diverse voices within those partnerships. Maggie or Roy, if you want to add anything.
The one I would add would be recruit, retain, and employ and retain. Coach, I would lean on you a little bit to really push for the educator workforce group to reconvene and continue our work that we started last year. I think that we started to brainstorm some ways to bring a diverse workforce to Vermont, but we would have to work less about Hartford and more about the state of Vermont and work in collaboration if we're going to be able to do this work.
Maggie, anything to add?
Nope.
Okay. And lastly is just a list of our continued partners. We have a few more that we've added to the list. Thanks to Maggie, actually. So thanks, Maggie, for your networking.
It's my pleasure. I like talking, as you can see.
And I think that's it. Any thoughts, questions, or comments?
It's obviously early in the implementation of the various programs. I think you have made a credible start, and I look forward to seeing the results.
I echo that.
I'd like to move that we approve, or at least accept, the report on EL10 race and equity.
Second. Sorry, Heather.
So there's a motion on the floor to accept the first report on EL10. And as noted, because of the nature of this particular policy, this is just the first ideation or the first instance of reporting. Because as we saw from the plan, there's a lot going on, a lot coming forward. So we'll be looking forward for the updates, as we move forward, even if it's not a formal, request, similar to what you've been doing with the ends policies. And we might be able to tap Maggie for that piece, to add to the cast of players, so to speak, in reporting on a regular basis.
Okay, yeah. So where are we? Do we need to vote?
Yes.
Okay. Is there any further debate or discussion? Just hearing none. All those in favor?
Aye.
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 And any opposed? Nope. Motion carries unanimously.
Great.
Okay. And can I get a copy of that email to me, Roy? Thank you. So then the next thing on our agenda is the executive session. Is that still gonna? Okay. So Peter, as our designated executive session motion, could you do that?
Indeed. So I would move that we find that there's a need for an executive session to discuss a labor relations agreement with employees, and that we hold a executive session pursuant to 1 VSA 313 A1B for such a meeting. For purpose, I should say.
Anybody want a second?
Second.
Okay. Any further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Anybody opposed? Hearing none, so now we're in executive session.
Do we need to do anything with the
Yeah.
video to make sure that we are just school board members?
Videoed.
Do we record our executive session? No.
No,
No.
they're not recorded, and only the school board members and the people who are supposed to be talking are supposed to be there.
So we are still recording.
Okay.
And we're live on YouTube still.
Okay, so we need to have that turned off.
Mine is still saying they're on too.
Yeah.
Ah, there we go.
And who was on the phone?
too.
Yeah, who's 603 7900178? Oh, they're gone.
They're off.
All right. All right. So is everybody ready in the room?
It still says we're live on YouTube.
Okay. The recording indicator and the